Welcome to the 311th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Christopher Snyder, author of the book Hobbit Virtues, Rediscovering Virtue Ethics through J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Stay tuned for the interview. If you're new to audiobooks, they're the perfect way to get more books into your busy life. Listen to audiobooks during your commute, while doing chores, walking the dog, or just relaxing at home. All you need is a smartphone and the free Libro.fm app. If you already love audiobooks and don't know what to listen to next, check out recommendations and curated lists from people who know audiobooks best, your local bookseller. Reading and Writing Podcast special offer: get 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 with your first month of membership with code RWPodcast. That's code RWPodcast for 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 for your first month of membership at Libro.fm. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Christopher Snyder, author of the new book Hobbit Virtues. Snyder is the founding dean of the Shackles Honors College at Mississippi State University and a professor of European history. He is also a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford, and he's also the author of The Making of Middle-earth and Gatsby's Oxford. Christopher, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me. It's nice to chat.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your book, Hobbit Virtues yet, how would you describe the book?
Well, it is a book about classical virtue ethics, but in a very accessible way through the lens of the fiction of J.R.R. Tolkien, especially looking at his depiction of hobbits in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
And if someone listening is not familiar with the phrase virtue ethics, how would you describe that for the listeners?
Sure. So virtue ethics was sort of a category, an area of philosophy that was invented probably by Socrates, or at least he's the first on record as a philosopher. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are primarily given credit for this way of viewing morality and ethics, rational choices, categorizing them, that kind of thing. Of course, it happens in all world religions. So classical virtue ethics sort of starts with Plato and Aristotle, but it's something that theologians talk about in Judaism and Christianity and Islam and Hinduism, Buddhism. And my book really covers all of that ground, all of the ancient and medieval philosophies and world religions. I'm really interested in how much they overlap in their recognition of virtues.
And so you obviously have an interest in J.R.R. Tolkien with this book and the previous book that you had written about Tolkien. What was your first experience reading Tolkien?
Gosh, I'm kind of a child of the TV generation. So I think I grew up as a child watching the cartoon versions of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit before I tackled reading them. I think in college probably is when I started reading Tolkien, certainly The Hobbit. It took me a while to get into The Lord of the Rings. A lot of people have that problem that there's an awful lot of Hobbit talk, not a lot of action going on in that first book. So it wasn't immediately a huge fan of Tolkien's fiction. I was at the time training as a medievalist, and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were both medievalists. So I was reading their academic works all along, but I think it really wasn't until my kind of late 20s that I sort of became a real fan of Tolkien's fiction.
And what is a medievalist? Is that someone who studies medieval history?
That's right. Yeah. So my training is primarily in ancient and early medieval European history and archaeology. I've also written quite a bit on King Arthur. So Arthurian studies and medieval studies are very overlapping areas. And Tolkien has now become a really popular subject, not just generally, but medievalists are really interested in looking at how he used medieval sources, both as a scholar and as a writer of fiction.
And so was there a specific idea or impetus that led you to writing Hobbit Virtues? And I should add that the full title of the book is Hobbit Virtues, Rediscovering Virtue Ethics Through J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And I'm just curious, what led you to writing this book?
The impetus for this project was really after the 2016 presidential election, after the Brexit voting. Probably a lot of people felt this way, but the civil discourse wasn't very civil. An awful lot of rancor, a lot of name calling and misunderstanding, and people, even in the same cultures, the same families, weren't doing a very good job of talking to one another. And I was trying to think of a very positive way to deal with that. And I thought that virtue ethics is something that even if you're a different member of a different political party or race or religion, that you can still recognize classical virtues when they appear, either in literature and film or in real life, that we tend to respond to things like courage and self-sacrifice when we see it in a positive way, regardless of our backgrounds. So it used to be kind of a language that we could speak to each other with, and I felt like culturally we'd lost track of that a little bit. And so I wanted to write something. I was working on a handout for my students about comparative virtue ethics, and I thought, well, maybe I could develop this into a book. And then I decided to focus it particularly not just on Tolkien, but on the hobbits. I think being the little people, the overlooked and the marginalized, they have a very peculiar and interesting perspective on the world of the big folk, politics and business and all of these things. I think that it's hard for many of us to imagine ourselves as a warrior king or an elf or something, but I think a lot of us can relate to hobbits.
Well, that kind of segues into my next question. As we sit here in 2020 dealing with a global pandemic, which sadly didn't take too long before it has resulted in an angry divide between Americans and how different people in the U.S. and in different states are reacting to the pandemic. What do you think Tolkien and the virtues in Tolkien have to offer us today in terms of this kind of conversation and discourse?
Well, I think, first of all, the Hobbit lifestyle would be one that would be a little more conducive to social distancing. Hobbits live in small villages, small towns. They don't tend to travel a lot. They don't like big machines. They don't like complicated machinery. Their lifestyle is very much agrarian, very much related to growing food and eating food, drinking beer, smoking pipes, that kind of thing. So the social aspect of what's going on, how much we miss the interaction. I think that, that I've been thinking about that a lot in writing the book and editing the book. And I think that the hobbits would, like us, be missing some of those social interactions. But in terms of our talking to each other, we're trying to do the best with the technology we have, right? So podcasts are one of the ways that we can stay in contact with one another, because that social side of who they are is really important, especially this notion of fellowship. And so there's a chapter in the book on fellowships, not just friendship, but particularly the way Tolkien defines fellowship.
So, as you mentioned earlier, you explore Tolkien's writings and ideas both from Eastern philosophies and religions as well as Christianity. Do you think one of those predominates in Tolkien's fictional universe?
Well, of course, Tolkien was a devout Catholic. He was a medievalist. He was a professional scholar of European literature and especially of the literature of the early Middle Ages. in Britain and in Northern Europe. So those virtues and those literatures, they're going to be especially heavy and resonate with him. He was influenced by lots of things, not so much Eastern religion or something like Buddhism or Hindu mythology, but his friend C.S. Lewis was more expansive in what he wrote about, and he did a little exercise called the Tao, in which he looked at the way that the religious codes of the world and philosophies overlap so much and what we identify as virtuous behavior and vile behavior. And he called it the way, or the Tao. So he very much was looking at Eastern religions and seeing how all of us either are born with this recognition of virtue. For Lewis, he would say we are created with it. It's a reflection of what the creator wanted. But it also kind of works in other philosophies. In biological evolution, you could say that natural selection allowed those creatures who exhibited these virtues to survive over time, to be selected. So it really is a common language throughout the world, if we can recognize it, again, especially in literature and film. And Tolkien's books, as you know, probably are published in dozens of languages and were successful all around the world, as the films have been. And that's a good sign for us, I think, recognizing not just a good story and good characters, but the behavior of good characters, or the good behavior of characters.
That kind of segues exactly into what I was going to ask you next. Tolkien was a veteran of World War I, and the Fellowship of the Ring, the first volume in The Lord of the Rings, was published in July of 1954. Why do you think, and you probably just answered it, why do you think Tolkien's work has stood the test of time and are still best-selling books today?
Yeah, so in my last two book projects, I spent a lot of time in Oxford, in particular, looking at the years around World War I and just after the war, the experiences that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien had at that time, but also other writers too, and people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote from the war generation perspective, and it certainly shapes the way they view war and politics. But all three of those authors chose to explore these themes through medieval ways, telling quest stories, telling stories about kind of larger than life heroic figures, even if they're flawed heroes. And I think that regardless of our culture or our geographic region, whatever, we recognize those heroes, those archetypes, almost when they appear in any kind of literature, or if they appear in the political stage, we can recognize them. And going back to the pandemic, I write a lot about courage in this book as a chief virtue, one that a lot of people wouldn't expect little hobbits to be courageous, but they display both physical courage and moral courage. Aristotle thought both of those things were important. And I think what we're seeing with first responders, with medical professionals, is an awful lot of courage right now, and courage with people fighting the disease as well. So I think it's very timely that we are looking at some of these virtues.
Is there a specific virtue in the book that resonates with you personally?
I would say that kind of the foundational virtue is humility. I think Tolkien very much knew what he was doing in creating the Hobbit as a small creature who lives under the earth or burrows holes into the earth, because humility comes from the Latin word humus, which means earth. And hobbits are literally down to earth, close to their roots of things. And I think Thomas Aquinas, who was another philosopher that Tolkien would have been inspired by, wrote a lot about humility as a key to other virtues. We can, if we start at a humble place, that doesn't mean false humility. That doesn't mean LeBron James pretending he's not a great basketball player. It's humility is really walking in the true light of who you are. And so understanding what you can do, what your limitations are, I think is really important as you set off on kind of a quest, on a virtue quest, to respond to situations in ways that are courageous or sacrificing or loving. I think if you go back to starting with humility, you're more likely to have success in those quests.
Well, in the early 2000s, people started listing Jediism as a religion on their national census. In 2001, 70,000 people in Australia listed Jediism as their religion in the national census. And obviously, Jediism is obviously based on the philosophies from George Lucas's fictional universe. And then at the same time, we have a number of surveys over the last 10 to 15 years that show in Western countries a pretty steep increase in people listing no religious affiliation. I'm wondering, have you considered why people are seeking philosophy or religion from popular culture?
Well, I think we all always have, and Tolkien knew that storytelling was essential. So storytelling is another virtue that I talk about. I think it's something we can all do utilizing different ways, but we can tell stories. And Tolkien really saw that as important. So religions do best when they tell these stories, right? When they use myth as a vehicle to tell stories across time. This is what I tell my students about dragons. When I say dragons are real because they're a myth in many cultures that convey this idea of violence and greed and a wise, intelligent evil. Many stories in the West tell those, or many religions and traditions tell those similar stories. So I think the Jedi and Star Wars fans in particular are responding to literature or film in a very similar way that Tolkien did. And if you look at interviews with George Lucas, Peter Jackson, they influenced each other quite a bit. And George Lucas was influenced by a guy named Joseph Campbell, who wrote about these archetypes in mythology, in world mythology. So it's not that religion is opposed to that at all. Religions all use myths, they use stories to convey religious truths, to convey virtues. I think it's just that perhaps the films are doing that a little better right now than other means of telling stories. I think you could throw in the Marvel universe and comics as well. America's mythology, many people would argue, are these comic books and the films they've generated. But if you and I disagree with folks who say they're not art. I think they definitely can be art. They can be doing things like conveying these truths. And if you look at something like the Avengers and see the fate of Iron Man, you see that we are responding well to self-sacrifice. It's not just the hero who's big and strong and brags about their strength, but sometimes it's just the person who makes that sacrifice for others that we respond to.
So you've written about and studied Tolkien for this book and for an earlier book, The Making of Middle-earth. Did you discover anything in your research about Tolkien that surprised you?
He wasn't a very good student when he started at university. I think that surprised me a bit. He was a classics major, as a lot of people were at Oxford, and he did not do very well in his first year exams. He was distracted by learning languages that were not Greek and Latin. And so after his first year exams, he had a very kind mentor who told him, you might want to consider an English major, which had just been created at Oxford. And he found himself in English literature and Anglo-Saxon literature in particular. So I was kind of interested to see that, as smart as he was, a man who easily spoke and translated over 20 languages, still was struggling with something that he was majoring in, because that's not where his heart was. His heart really wasn't with Greco-Roman authors. It was really with Beowulf and the Kalevala and the Eddas, the Norse mythology. That's what he really loved. So it took him a while to discover that.
So are you planning or working on your next book yet?
I'm really debating about the next book project. I've been working on a book on higher education, and I got a long way into that book, but with the challenges that the pandemic have thrown to educators and administrators, that book will have to take a turn in its direction. I'd certainly like writing about authors. Even though I'm a historian, I wrote a lot about the early Middle Ages and early medieval Britain. I do like writing about how authors use the past, not just the Middle Ages or medieval, but medievalism, our interpretation of the past. That matters too. The success of Tolkien and Lewis and Harry Potter, in large part, is because they're medievalists, in the sense that they're using this medievalism, this reimagining of the past. Game of Thrones would be another example of that. So there are lots of ideas bubbling around right now.
And so what books have you read recently that you would recommend, either fiction or nonfiction?
Oh, geez. I'm reading all kinds of things because of my teaching as well. And I borrowed a book of Gandhi's writings from my daughter. Gandhi had been a hero of mine in college, and read a bit about him, but not a lot of his own writings. And I quite like the Cambridge University Press edition of Gandhi's writings. I just taught Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, which is a book I had never read before, and I really enjoyed the approach she was taking in that. I don't tend to read a lot of contemporary literature, being a medieval historian.
Sure.
I tend to read a lot of old stuff, but I would say it is always worth rereading the classics. So now is a perfect time to go back and reread The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings if you haven't in a while.
Great. Well, how has the pandemic impacted your teaching, and how are you adapting to that?
So I was teaching a seminar, an undergraduate seminar, core text seminar of about 15 students. In the middle of the semester, we had to convert that as the students left campus to an online seminar. And I'd never taught online before, and I chose to do it synchronously. So, we used the technology to talk to one another. And I was really skeptical about how that would go. And it surprised me. It went much better than I thought. We were able to use the chat feature while talking as well. And I think it succeeded because we missed each other. That even if it's seeing faces on the screen, talking to each other that way, we really needed that moment in the day to reconnect as teacher and student. And I really appreciated their work, their efforts on that. And I had to do a lot of work too that I wasn't expecting. So I find that my faculty in the Honors College, we're used to small class sizes and being in these intimate environment with students. And we just don't have that right now, and we hope to get it back soon.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Christopher Snyder, author of the new book, Hobbit Virtues, Rediscovering Virtue Ethics through J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Go buy the book now. And Christopher, thanks for doing this interview.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. I really enjoyed my time chatting with you.
Great.